Hi, I'm Al Pearsall from the U.S. Department of Justice Cops Office, and I'm here with Chief Ronnie Baston from the Lexington Division of Police in Kentucky, Officer Shelley Sonnenberg from the Boise, Idaho Police Department, and Director Mark Prosser from the Storm Lake, Iowa Police Department. Thank you for joining us live for our webcast, Bridging the Language Divide. In this webcast, we will discuss promising practices for overcoming language barriers in policing. For those not familiar with the COPS Office, the COPS Office was created through the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. As a component of the Justice Department, the mission of the COPS Office is to advance the practice of community policing as an effective strategy to improve public safety. The COPS Office awards grants to tribal, state, and local law enforcement agencies to hire and train community policing professionals, acquire and deploy cutting-edge crime-fighting technologies, and develop and test innovative policing strategies. COPS Office funding provides training and technical assistance to advance community policing at all levels of law enforcement, from line officers to law enforcement executives, as well as others in the criminal justice field. Since 1995, the COPS Office has invested $12.4 billion to help law enforcement advance the practice of community policing and has enabled more than 13,000 state, local, and tribal agencies to hire more than 117,000 police officers and deputies. Additionally, the COPS Office offers publications, DVDs, CDs, and training materials on a wide range of law enforcement concerns and community policing topics. To date, we have distributed more than 1.1 million of these knowledge resources. Please visit the COPS website at www.cops.usdoj.gov. The topic of today's webcast is overcoming language barriers. Some of you might ask, why is it important? Well, one, it is the law. It is the goal of the federal government to reduce the language barriers for individuals with limited English proficiency seeking access to government services. Federal agencies are required to create plans to ensure that their activities are accessible to these people. At the same time, the government obligates organizations receiving federal assistance in the form of grants or training, for example, to take reasonable steps to ensure the same meaningful access to their programs. For more information about the federal law and policy regarding language access, go to www.lep.gov, which is the website for the Federal Interagency Working Group on Limited English Proficiency. 2, the number of immigrants, as well as native-born Americans with limited English proficiency living within the United States is growing. And they are dispersed in many small towns, rural areas, suburbs, small cities, large cities throughout the country. As a result, there is an increasing need for resources to assist officers in learning and working with the languages they come in contact with. Overcoming language barriers is essential to effective crime fighting, because it is often the inability to communicate with law enforcement that prevents victims from reporting crimes and witnesses from helping police solve crimes. The inability to communicate with limited English proficient individuals is a major impediment to building partnerships, problem solving, and advancing community policing. So now, let's move on to the webcast. This webcast is a continuation of the partnership between the Vera Institute of Justice and the COPS Office toward ensuring the civil rights protection of all in the delivery of law enforcement services. During this webcast, from around about 1:10 p.m. to 2 p.m., we'll learn from the experiences of 3 agencies that have developed promising solutions to overcoming language barriers. Then we'll have a live question and answer period until around 2:25 p.m. This will be an opportunity for you, the viewers, to submit online question to the panelists. Please, in your question, tell us what state you're from. After the webcast, we will invite you, the audience, to review the new COPS Vera publication entitled Bridging the Language Divide, Promising Practices for Law Enforcement, and also the 2007 COPS Vera publication, Overcoming Language Barriers, Solutions for Law Enforcement. The first publication, Overcoming Language Barriers, Solution for Law Enforcement, is also available on the COPS website. And the second publication, Bridging the Language Divide, Promising Practices for Law Enforcement, should be available on the COPS website in the near future. Whether your agency is able to implement some or all of these strategies shared in these reports or this webcast, we feel all viewers will benefit greatly from the information shared in the webcast. The first person, I'd like to begin now with our presenters. The first person to present is Chief Ronnie Baston of the Lexington, Kentucky Division of Police. Chief Baston began his career with the Lexington Division of Police on October 15th of 1984. His law enforcement career has been augmented with experience as a correctional officer and case manager at the Blackburn Correctional Facility in Lexington, Kentucky. Chief Baston is a 1978 graduate of the University of Kentucky with a Bachelor of Science degree. In 1982, he earned a Master of Science degree in Criminal Justice from Eastern Kentucky. He is also a 1997 graduate of the Southern Police Institute's Administrative Officers course. Chief Baston is a member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the IACP, the Kentucky Association of Chiefs of Police, and the Kentucky Peace Officers Association. In 2004, he was appointed by the International Association of Chiefs of Police president to serve on the Police Image and Ethics Committee. Chief Baston has presented national and international workshops for law enforcement executives. Chief Baston, could you share your information with us, please?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Pearsall. As was mentioned, I'm from Lexington, Kentucky. Lexington is the second largest city in Kentucky. We have a population of about 280,000 residents. Our police department has an authorized strength of 595 officers, and we employ about 150 civilians. This afternoon, I'm going to share with you some information about what we call our advanced language program and how it evolved. Prior to the mid-1990s, Lexington virtually had no permanent Spanish-speaking population. For many years, we had migrant workers come to our community for temporary labor seasons. These groups were largely male, and after their services were no longer needed, they would return home or go somewhere else where there was a demand. Due to employment opportunities and a thriving economy in the mid-1990s, we began to see a change in our community. During that time, we saw people would bring their families when they would come for the labor seasons, and when the labor seasons were over, they didn't leave. Signs of a permanent population started to emerge. Signs such as check cashing services, special grocery stores, and specialty restaurants. Police contact started to grow exponentially. Prior to that time, as an agency, we had had very few contacts, and we usually seemed to find a way to get through the contact. As the contacts grew, we found that we were basically without the capability to provide service at the level we were used to providing. Out of 460 officers that the department had at that time, we only had 2 officers that were fluent in Spanish. We actually gave these 2 officers pagers and found ourselves calling them in the middle of the night. We actually wore the two people out. And we were struggling to find a way to train officers in Spanish so that we could have more skill available. We began our search for methods of training with the belief that it was important to provide services to everyone in the community. We tried several different approaches to provide training to our officers, and quite honestly found a lot of things that didn't work very well for us. A real break came in 1997 when a consulate official from the Mexican consulate was visiting with our mayor and having some discussions about what our community was doing and some of the issues we were experiencing as a result of our Spanish-speaking population that was emerging. He actually mentioned and offered to coordinate trips immersion experiences, if you will, for police in an effort to try to provide us with some capability to communicate better. We followed up with the individual and actually scheduled 2 trips with officers who did have some Spanish skills. Both those trips involved officers traveling to Mexico, staying at a police academy for about 4 weeks, and experiencing many things while they were there. Those 2 experiences provided us a great look at what opportunities that immersion would provide. While those opportunities had no formal language training component, we did see great value in immersion. In the fall of 1999, we began discussions with Dr. Fred DeRose and Dr. Milton Grimes from the Kentucky Institute of International Studies to work with us to develop a program that would meet our needs. They proposed a program consisting of both a classroom component and an immersion component in Morelia, Mexico. The classroom training was conducted at the Division of Police and consisted of an 18-hour curriculum, a very intensive curriculum. Vicki Rodriguez is on the slide now. She is the instructor, a college-level instructor, who travels from Mexico and lives in Lexington while we're conducting those classroom sessions. In addition to the 18 hours of college credit that participants can get for the classroom training, participants may receive up to 6 hours of college credit for participation in the immersion component of the program, for a total of 24 hours of college credit being earned. The immersion program consists of officers living with a family in Mexico, in Morelia, Mexico, for 5 weeks. Morelia is a city in the state of Michoacan. It's a city of about 1 million people. It's located about 100 miles from Mexico City. We found that many of the people in our community actually had come from this area in Mexico. While in Mexico, officers attend classes for 4 hours a day. They participate in practical exercises specifically designed for police officers. Officers are exposed to their Mexican counterparts through visits to the police academy, prisons, juvenile detention facilities, ride-alongs, and they also do presentations at the academy. This is one of our officers talking with Mexican police officers. We think that this is a very valuable experience for our folks who are participating in the program. In this slide, the officer presenting is one of our police officers, and he's presenting to a class at the police academy in Morelia. It's a great way for us to share and reciprocate, share information about American policing to the officers in Mexico. This slide has one of our officers, the officer in the center, the lady in the center, Officer Lynn Borders, pictured with her host family. Experiencing family life provides a great insight into Mexican culture. It allows officers to carry out their responsibilities when they return to Lexington while being sensitive to any cultural differences that there may be. Completion of the program provides participants with an intermediate level of conversational Spanish, enough that they can have meaningful dialogue with residents when they return to Lexington. As a result of this program, we now have over 100 officers that are fluent in Spanish. We use this capability and aggressively try to work within the community to build relationships with our Spanish-speaking community. In 2002, a survey was conducted as part of our participation in the International Association of Chiefs of Police Collaborative Leadership Project. The results of the survey indicated that our program was impacting the Spanish-speaking segment of our community. The slide shows the headlines from our local Latino newspaper, La Voz. La Voz reported those results to the community, indicating that Latinos surveyed had a positive opinion of the police in Lexington, something that we were very proud of. A few of the highlights of the survey indicated that Spanish-speaking individuals in the community were aware of our efforts to train officers and that they'd actually spoken, in some cases, to the officers. 57% of the people surveyed said that they were aware of the program that the department had. And with a population that tends to move quite a bit, we felt that that was significant. 32% of the people actually said they had spoken to one of our officers in Spanish, which, again, shows the amount of contact and opportunities to build relationships that the program has presented. It also reinforced the importance of having the capacity to communicate to address some of our basic functions of crime and some other issues. 86% of the people surveyed said that they would be more likely to report a problem knowing they could speak with a Spanish-speaking officer. I think that's something that we knew, but the data actually reinforced what our beliefs prior to the survey were. Another important factor was that 66% of the folks indicated that at some point since being in this country they had wanted to report a problem but hadn't due to a perceived language barrier. We believe that our program has given our agency a very strong foundation from which to serve and build bridges of trust within our Spanish-speaking segment of our community. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chief. I'd like to also add that the collaborative leadership project that you mentioned with IACP is also a COPS-funded initiative. So thank you for mentioning that. I have a question for you, Chief Bastion. You mentioned that the advanced language program had an unintended benefit of teaching officers about Mexican culture. How can you emphasize how this has helped your agency, or has it?
Well, it has. There have been several unanticipated consequences that we've experienced as we've gone through the program. One of the most important things that officers bring back with them after participation in the Immersion program is that while they're there, they get to experience what it's like to be a stranger in a foreign land and not have total command of the language and the culture. We think that makes officers much more patient when they're back home serving in their capacity, when they run into someone on the street who doesn't have command of our language. And we think that's a great benefit. Also, as I mentioned earlier, officers are able to perform their duties much more proficiently with a knowledge of cultural differences. They take those into account when they're actually working and on the street and dealing with individuals on calls. The other anticipated consequence that I would bring to the audience's attention is the fact that this program has developed into a model that others have chosen to follow. There have been other police agencies that have programs that are designed based on this model now. I know of several. Probably the most recent and maybe the largest is Kansas City, Missouri, who has a very fine program that's up and running. But the program's also evolved into models for other professions. Healthcare, clergy, social work, judges, and even college professors have tailored programs based on this model that was developed.
I'd like to add that Vera has, in a noteworthy fashion, categorized your practice as improving personnel skills. Our next presenter is Officer Shelley Sonnenberg, Boise, Idaho Police Department. Officer Shelley Sonnenberg graduated cum laude from the University of Idaho in 1998 with a degree in crime and justice studies. She began her law enforcement career with the Boise Police Department in 1999, at which time she was honored to be voted the first female president of her post academy. Officer Sonnenberg has considerable experience working in patrol. In 2003, she joined the community policing team, where she is currently a community outreach officer and refugee liaison for the department. She works closely with the refugee resettlement agencies and community outreach groups in the area, providing educational and safety information to new Americans as they arrive in Boise. She's a member of the Crisis Negotiation Team and a member of the Honor Guard. In 2006, Officer Sonnenberg was chosen as the Boise Police Department Officer of the Year by her peers, something she considers to be a highlight of her career thus far. Could you please share your information with us, Officer Sonnenberg?
Yes, thank you. As Al said, I've been an officer for 10 years with the Boise Police Department, so I'm definitely the rookie here at this panel, but I'll do my best to share a little bit about Boise and about our program. Boise is the third largest city in the Pacific Northwest. However, we only have about 200,000 people living within our city. My agency consists of a little over 300 officers, and we have approximately 60 civilians that work with us. Boise is also a major hub for refugee relocation. We have 4 agencies in town that relocate, resettlement agencies in town that relocate refugees to our area. This slide represents some of the refugees that we have living in Boise, but definitely not all of them. In fact, we have over 100 languages spoken in our school systems, businesses, and homes right now. As you can imagine, it's wonderful having that much diversity within the city, but it has caused some serious issues involving language barriers, especially with law enforcement. Up until this point, law enforcement's been doing what most agencies are doing. We do the best we can with what we've got. But oftentimes what happens, officers arrive at a scene and we use neighbors or family members, and unfortunately even children at times, to help with that language barrier, that communication gap. Our department took a look at that and felt that we could do more, that we could do better. And so we reached out to those resettlement agencies and to find out who a refugee is, where they're from, why are they here, and really to find out where the challenges are, where the struggles are for those refugees so we can better serve them. Some of the challenges we discovered were pretty obvious. Some of these refugees are coming from areas that have substandard conditions, that they're living in what we would call an epitome of a refugee camp. That's not all of them. Some of them live in housing establishments a lot like you and I. But there's definitely a difference in coming from another country to the U.S. and trying to adapt to our customs and our culture. On top of that, many of the refugees do not speak English, so they have a struggle there in trying to communicate, and it puts up a barrier. The laws in their country are very different than the laws here in the U.S. The minute they touch foot on our soil, they're responsible for abiding by our laws, yet many of them don't know what those laws are. Domestic violence and domestic violence laws, battery situations, child abuse situations, many of these terms don't even exist in their culture, let alone our laws in their culture. So there's a difficulty for them, a struggle for them to understand what they're supposed to do when they don't know that the laws of the country they're living in. Obviously, there's also a huge fear of the police. Many of the agencies, many of the police officers that they've dealt with in the past have been corrupt. I had a Russian man, I asked for his driver's license, pulling him over for speeding. He gives me $50. I hand it back to him and say, "No, sir, I need your driver's license." And he gives me $100. So there's in his culture that's appropriate. He's had some learning to do here, and that's part of law enforcement's role is to educate. And it's a challenge that we needed to be aware of. I share this picture with a lot of people. I think it's important for us to understand where some of the refugees are coming from. They don't have electricity, they don't have running water, and they come to the United States, and a lot is happening in those first few months that they're here. And I just like to share this to give people an idea, maybe give them an opportunity to be a little more patient when dealing with the refugee communities. So what my agency decided to do after speaking with the resettlement agencies is to reach out to those other members in the community, those businesses and agencies and departments that maybe were dealing with the same issues that we were, that language barrier issue. So we reached out to the hospitals, health and welfare. We reached out to Boise State University, the university there in Boise, the court systems and the school systems, to find out what they were doing and find out how maybe we could work to create a program that was going to help everyone. It was it was a learning experience, and it definitely made our program run much better after discussing things with them. After we did all of that, my job was to convince the command staff and the city council and the mayor that this was something that was really important and we needed to look into it. The way I chose to present this was to show them why it's important to Boise Police Department, why it's important to the city. we decided that the protection of the officers, the refugee, and the agencies was really the number one reason that we should do this. In Idaho, it snows a lot, especially right now. So you walk into a home and you wipe off your feet on a rug. In a Christian home, that's appropriate. In a Muslim home, you might want to make sure that that's not the prayer rug that you're wiping your feet on. There's a protection there. There's an escalation that could happen without having the proper knowledge of the culture that you're walking into. The other thing was the community policing concept. It's easy to say, yeah, we have that concept within our community or within our police department, but are we actually doing something about it? We wanted to show that we believed in community policing and that we were reaching out to the community to provide that better service. The other thing that I think helped the most was to just talk about the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That pretty much spells it up for law enforcement agencies. What it says, if you're receiving federal money, you're required to provide equal and fair service. That's not one that you can really argue with. So we knew that we had to do better at that point. The other thing, we weren't giving our officers much direction. Even though the Department of Justice and doesn't require you to have a policy, it's helpful for the officers to know what you're expecting of them and where to look and where to go when you need an interpreter. To let them know that using an informal interpreter might not be the best idea. If you have the opportunity to have somebody who's a credentialed interpreter to come and help you with the scene, that's the best way to do it. Now, as officers, we know it's always not going to be possible. You have emergency situations, and you're going to have to use those informal interpreters. But as a rule, my department decided that we didn't want to use that. We wanted to use those interpreters that we knew were credited. What we also did was we did create some documents in languages that we were dealing with. The Bosnian community was one of the first refugee communities that came to Idaho. We created some of the domestic violence pamphlets and child abuse pamphlets for them. I have some refugee communities that are illiterate, and printing out those documents is probably not going to make a lot of sense. If they can't read their language or English, then it's a waste of money. But nonetheless, there were some communities that we felt that it was going to be helpful, and we did that. Ultimately, what we did, we went in and we said, hey, the chief was behind me on this. He said, ultimately, it's the right thing to do. Everybody handles things a little bit differently. My suggestion to those of you who are out there, what we did personally was look at what our need was. We had a situation where we used an informal interpreter in a jurisdiction just close to us. It was a shaken baby situation. The interpreter, when the interview was done, the interpreter that was used, we found out that many of the things that were said were misunderstood, misquoted. He left some things out, and unfortunately in that case, it moved from a murder case to a manslaughter case. That affected our community. We wanted to make sure that didn't happen again. The other thing we considered was how long were the officers dealing with situations out there that were involving limited English persons, proficient persons. Was it taking more time using somebody who wasn't an efficient interpreter? Just because you know both languages doesn't make you a good interpreter. So we really looked into the time that was being used in those situations. Obviously, the frustration of both individuals, the officer and the LEP persons, that's something to consider, because as time goes on and it's taking longer and longer to take care of the call, the frustrations rise. And then ultimately for us, it came down to our resources. We had limited resources. We did have the language line, but it was very expensive, and we just felt that there was another opportunity for us to maybe reach out to the community and use the refugees as interpreters and as cultural brokers. First thing we did, reached out to those refugee agencies that were using interpreters, asked them to please identify who you think would work well with the Boise Police Department. There's a lot of trauma that these refugees have experienced. If they've watched their family be murdered in front of them, that's probably not appropriate for us to ask them to come to a murder scene. So we really asked them to choose them carefully and make sure that it was going to be a good fit. All of our refugee interpreters went through an application and a background check. You know, they're refugees. Some of them couldn't read English very well, so we helped them with the application process. That didn't take away from their interpreter skills, but it was important that we had them fill the application out completely. We put them through a training program so they understood law enforcement, what was expected of them. We needed to find out what was expected of us. And then ultimately we set up a payment plan to make sure that they were being compensated. We're not on the low end, we're not on the high end, we're right in the middle, and it seems to be working out very well. And then we also wanted to provide some type of an accountability on both. Have the supervisors evaluate how that interpreter is working, and have that interpreter evaluate how the police officers are working with them as well. What we're hoping is that this provides the interpreters themselves, gives them some investment in their community. Not just their refugee community, but the Boise community. It allows them to give back, and to be honest with you, we're learning so much from them. I use that word cultural broker. I mean it. It's not just language that we need to learn. We need to also understand their customs and their cultures. We're hoping that that turns into a full-time position for the interpreters, that they don't have to hold down 2 or 3 jobs, that maybe this can be their primary job. And then what I tell everybody, just share your resources. If you have one that's a really good person, share that with everybody else so we all have the ability to use a very good, strong, credible interpreter.
Thank you very much, Officer Sonnenberg. I'd like to ask you a question. What lesson have you learned about forming effective partnerships? Because it appears that partnerships with local organizations have been integral to your program.
Yes, they were integral. We couldn't have created this program without the partnerships. You know, it was interesting. Once you open the door, it is amazing to me how many people are willing to come through that and work with you. One of the things that came out of that, working with Boise State University, they saw that that door was open and they brought us together. We collaborated, and they brought in all those people I mentioned before, the hospitals, the school system, health and welfare. They brought all of us together, and we created a diversity project per se. We established that there's a need for interpreters for everyone in Boise. I mean, you look at the lending world or you look at the banking world, there are always going to be those needs. We created a website where interpreters can be listed. It's an opportunity and a resource for people who don't know how to get an interpreter to maybe find one. Working with the medical field, we created a women's seminar for the refugee women to give them an opportunity, a forum to ask questions about some of the things that they wouldn't feel comfortable doing maybe in front of their husbands and in front of everybody else. They've allowed the police department to work with them on that. So they're now going over medical issues and maternity issues, and then we talk about domestic violence since it's such an unusual crime in some of those countries. So I guess what I've learned is that when you open that door, it becomes so much more than you really intended and expected.
Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Mark A. Prosser. He's the Public Safety Director for the Storm Lake, Iowa, but he's also the police chief of Storm Lake, Iowa's police department. Mark Prosser attended Eastern Kentucky University, where he earned Bachelor of Science in Police Administration. He has further completed some graduate studies in management at Webster University in St. Louis, Missouri. Director Prosser was hired in 1980 as a patrol officer with the O'Fallon, Illinois Police Department. During his career with O'Fallon, he also served as a juvenile officer, detective, and chief of detectives. He further served as an investigator and supervisor for the St. Louis Major Case Squad, a multi-jurisdictional homicide task force. In 1989, he was hired as chief of police for the city of Storm Lake, Iowa. In June of 2000, he was appointed public safety director with administrative oversight over police, fire, emergency management, animal control, crossing guards, and park ranger operations for the city of Storm Lake. Director Prosser is a member and past executive board member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, a member and past president of the Iowa Police Executive Forum, and an associate member of the Police Executive Research Forum. He has spoken extensively about policing issues and strategies surrounding the topic of diversity and shifting demographics. Director Prosser.
Thanks, Alan. Good afternoon. The city of Storm Lake, Iowa is located in rural northwest Iowa, unattached to any urban center, a community of about 12,000 people. My sworn staff is 19 officers, and with a total support staff, we have a total of 26 employees on the police department. A little bit different than our urban counterparts that have already presented to you today. One might ask why a rural community is presenting at this particular session on language barriers within their community. Storm Lake, although unique, is not alone in being a rural community, as many exist across the United States that have the same types of issues that our urban brothers and sisters do in dealing with a shifting and a changing demographic, one that brings challenges of culture, one that brings challenges of being able to appropriately communicate and provide services because of language barriers. Storm Lake, for almost 30 years now, has seen an ongoing shift in its demographics, and one that continues to shift today. Starting in the late 1970s and the early 80s with church-sponsored refugee relocation programs, the city started to see its first arrivals of non-English speaking citizens to the community in the form of Southeast Asian citizens from Laos and Vietnam. They came there because there were job opportunities in our packing plants in the community. As the community moved forward and as the plants were expanded and owned and operated by national organizations, continued recruitment occurred in different parts of the country to meet the needs of their employment base, because there was not an employment base in our rural community. In the early 1990s, Spanish-speaking citizens started to arrive in our community, and they continue to arrive today from a variety of Spanish-speaking countries, Mexico, Central America, and South America. At the same time in the 1990s, we had populations of Somalians and Ethiopians that came to our community, again through refugee relocation programs, all for the opportunity to be employed by our major employers in Storm Lake. In the late 70s and early, or not 2007, late 2007 and early 2008, we saw an influx of families from Asian Pacific islands. We've also seen a shift with African Americans moving to our community from urban centers across the United States, and most recently, new arrivals coming from the West Coast, Hmong citizens that are coming for employment opportunities. In a community unattached to urban areas and with limited resources, we ask, how do we deal with these language barriers? And going back as far as 1990, we saw our elected officials and our service providers saying that the critical issue in providing services, as services changed and as a need for services expanded, was the ability to communicate. In every meeting, every task force, every briefing that law enforcement was involved with, government, medical professionals, social services, educators, and the like, our ability to communicate with our clients, with those whom we were our victims, our witnesses, our students, and our patients, were talked about, that we were very much challenged there. The first way that we responded to that was to locate, create, and establish lists of volunteers, individuals who have moved to our community who were bilingual, who gave of their own time to provide bilingual services, in our case to public safety, and assist us in our times of need where we could not communicate with the citizens we were dealing with. We quickly found out that just as law enforcement and fire services were calling on these volunteers in the middle of the night and on weekends, so were the other disciplines that were experiencing language barriers in their businesses. And we quickly started to burn these individuals out. So we took the next step forward then, as opposed to just asking them to volunteer, is to pay them an hourly rate, primarily dealing with the languages of Spanish and Lao, which were our two largest foreign languages in the early 90s. The same thing happened. Other entities, other disciplines started paying also, and all of a sudden we were competing for the same individuals. In 1991, the Storm Lake City Council, collectively with the Buena Vista County Board of Supervisors, created a task force on unmet needs and commissioned a one-year study looking at how we can better serve our shifting demographics, clearly seeing that our community was changing and changing for all of the future, and how we could provide adequate services. A follow-up to that particular study was a report that many of the disciplines needed to engage in the full-time hiring process of bilingual employees so that we can provide those very much needed language services. In 1993, the city of Storm Lake, led by our city council and city administrative team, authorized the hiring of our first community service officer, followed by a second officer in 1994. They were our primary staff interpreters for the languages of Spanish and Lao. And we utilized these individuals from that day forward when we deal with language barriers. But beyond that, we also utilized them in civilian support service roles. Following again the examples set by our urban counterparts in the late 80s and early 90s to deal with budget challenges, we were looking at, or I was looking at, a proposal of getting civilian support service employees because we knew the city couldn't afford necessarily hiring many more sworn officers. Our city council at the time and our city administrative team at the time had the foresight to know that our city was moving in a direction that we were going to need language services. And so they said, yes, they authorized the creation and the funding of the community service officers, but said that these positions would be bilingual and service public safety and at that time city administration, our library, whoever needed them. And from that time forward, we have continued to progress through City Hall, our library services, our fire services, and adding bilingual positions who can help us communicate with our diverse culture. What we also found out is using our community service officers as a basis and as an anchor for working with our changing and shifting demographics, that we had to deal with it on a multifaceted approach, that it was just not one answer, that we needed to learn more about cultures, we needed to learn more about where our new citizens were coming from so that we could provide the appropriate training and exposure to our law enforcement officers, our firefighters, city employees as a whole, so that we could provide adequate services. And that occurred by the city and the police department being involved in a variety of other committees and task forces. Once again, early on and continuing to this day, the city established diversity task forces. We operate on a local level. We've also been involved at a state level dealing with this shift in demographics. What we found out in dealing with diversity task forces is that it was an opportunity to bring individuals of varying cultures to the table and learn about their cultures so that we in turn could provide better services. But in many cases, the task forces had no diversity. They were individuals, all white and Anglo individuals, sitting at a table talking about the diversity in our community when in fact our diverse citizens were not participants in the early task forces, primarily because of points that have already been made, previous experiences with government, not necessarily doing business the way we do it in the United States by going to meetings and forming task forces. It's more of, in many cases, who you know or knowing an individual who can work your particular problem up the chain of command or through a particular discipline. So there was trial and error, but nevertheless we kept moving forward and trying to learn more and more about our cultures. In addition, we realized that we needed to provide more training, cultural training, for our staff. And again, through the city, we created training opportunities and mandatory training on different cultures, working with the Iowa Civil Liberties Office, Bureau of Latino Affairs, several universities in Iowa that provided us these instructors to give us information on new cultures. And we continued to do that today and plan annual training for diversity-related and culture-related instruction for all city employees. We wanted to find out more about our cultures and how we were communicating with them. One of the current priorities of our organization, the city organization, as our community is transforming itself into a destination place seated on the north side of a beautiful lake, is outcomes in our interactions with the public. So above and beyond just training our staff with diversity training and cultural training, our current city administration, elected officials insist that we also move forward with customer service training for all employees, so that although we deal with a diverse community and we have situations where we deal in a multilingual situation, we also want to look at outcomes of our particular interaction and communication. Are we appropriately getting the message of public safety across? Are we appropriately getting the message of the other disciplines within city government across? And that continues today. So we deal with it in a multifaceted fashion, again, anchored around the ability to provide multilingual services within our community. Our sister city relationship, as we heard earlier about the Immersion program, we too are in the infancy in creating a relationship in the region of Jalisco, Mexico. We too have found that of the Spanish-speaking citizens that we have in Storm Lake, and they come from a variety of countries, there is a core group that come from the Santa Maria area and Ayatlan, where we know that individuals migrate from that area to the Storm Lake area. And so we're trying to create a sister city relationship where we can have an exchange and learn additional information. Sometimes people ask us as we deal with this issue of shifting demographics is how long will it last? When will it go back to the way it used to be? And the issue is this is the way we're going to be forever. This is our country. It's just not a Storm Lake issue. It's just not a Lexington or a Boise issue. It's an issue that our whole country is going through. And just an example of the impact it's had on our community is the current enrollment rates at our community school system. We have the most diverse school system in the state of Iowa, and although we're by far not the largest community, we are the most diverse community in the state of Iowa, showing over 50% of our students K through 12 being Hispanic or Latino, only 30% white, 10% Asian, 3.5% black, and 2.3% other. And we look to the future. We want to know, is this going to be the continued trend? And when you look at the future, quite often you look at the youth. They paint the picture of what your community or what our country will be. And if we look at just our pre-K through fourth grade percentages in our community school system, we see a 79% ratio of non-white students in our school system. So we understand that this is the direction that our community continues to move, and we understand that with that, we have to adapt public service and public safety so that we can communicate with all of the citizens and all of the communities within our jurisdiction.
Thank you, Director Prosser. What I'd like to do is ask you a question, and is, can you share why you decided to make the community service officers, or CSOs, civilian personnel and not sworn officers?
Absolutely. A variety of things happened at the same time, and quite often in any decision-making process that occurs where several points or several incidents will come together and cause you to go down a certain road. At the time in the early 90s that we created the community service officers position, we were looking for, one, some additional staffing to assist as the community was growing. Two, budgetary constraints where the city may not at that time been able to necessarily afford the addition of sworn officers, and then combined with our shift in demographics, the need for bilingual services. So as the city council and city administration approved the creation of the community service officers, they approved them as bilingual positions, knowing the need and knowing that we have to be able to provide those services. Today, we experience a language barrier, an estimated 1 in 4 contacts on the street, 1 in 3 contacts in the police station, and we cannot function without those bilingual employees.
Well, thank you. I'd like to note that Vera, in its publication, has noted your practice as a promising practice of maximizing resources. And I also like to indicate that when Officer Sonnenberg gave her presentation, I don't think I shared that the promising practice that Vera recognized was developing programs through partnerships in her presentation. At this time, what I'd like to do is to invite you, the audience, to send us your questions. And while you're getting your questions to us, I'd like to ask the presenters a few questions. What advice, and I'd like to pose this to each of the presenters, what advice would you give about developing programs such as your individual programs in the face of shrinking police budgets and resources? Any volunteers?
I'll be glad to go.
Thank you, Chief.
I don't think any of us have a crystal ball, and we all certainly have financial needs. These are very trying times, but I think we have to look for alternative sources of funding. I know with our program, there were no budget funds or grant funds when we initiated the program in 2000, and we believed in the concept enough that we actually prioritized using asset forfeiture money. So, in effect, the drug dealers of our jurisdiction helped us to start the program, and I think you have to look for innovative ways to fund things that are important.
Officer Sonnenberg?
Well, we were lucky. We did get a federal grant that was able to help with this project and this program. But before we got to that point and before we had the money, we still had the same issues. We were able to reach out to our community. Hewlett-Packard is a large company that we work with, and they have people from all over the world that work for them. When we didn't have the money to pay an interpreter, we worked with the volunteers there and asked them to come and assist us in the interpreting when we needed somebody. The grants to keep this program going, I know that we're going to need the grants, and it's hard during these times, but I think like all of us, we're trying to do the best with what we've got and provide that service no matter what.
Director Prosser?
I think that a lot of it has to do with the team approach of public safety, working with the elected officials and the city administration team to know what priorities are. In our community, the shift in demographics was quick and was drastic, and it continues to be that way today, and we have to be able to provide services. There are no laws on the book that say if you don't speak English, you don't appropriately respond to a police call or get the appropriate information. We have to be able to do that, and our elected officials and administrative team know that that's a priority. But nevertheless, budget is a challenge, and it's very challenging in these times. We have been blessed in Storm Lake in just the last few months in receiving a substantial donation specific to our community service officer program that will help fund that program for the next several years. So that worry hopefully won't be there for us for a few years, but it shows the value and the respect of that program in the community.
Director, who was the donation from?
It was an anonymous donation, sir.
Wow, anonymous donation. That's very significant. It really indicates that there's obviously, it's hit a chord in your community.
It is.
You know, we've got viewer questions, and I'm so excited. Woohoo! And what I'd like to share is that we've got a lot of questions coming in. I am happy that you're interested, and we're going to try to answer as many as we can. The first question is from two viewers from Ohio and Nebraska, and they're for Chief Baston. And that's a question that I had in my mind as well. How did your agency fund the Immersion program, including travel and per diem for officers?
Well, as I mentioned before, we started the program and funded with asset forfeiture funds. Later, a couple of years after the program was initiated, we were able to use some federal funding. But it's a challenge to find that funding. There have been no budgeted dollars to this point that have gone into the program.
Well, we've got another question, and this is for Officer Sonnenberg. And this is from Nebraska. Well, a lot of people in Nebraska are interested. Who verifies the credentials of your interpreters? And maybe you want to add also your translators. I'll just add that too, your interpreters and your translators.
The process that they go through, the background is actually done by the people who do the backgrounds for our police officers. So they're trained, and it's not me that's just looking at them saying, oh, I saw them on the street and asked them to come along and help us. We have them fill out the application process, and then the backgrounders actually go out and check and make sure that everything that they've written is honest and true.
I'd like to ask a question of each of you. How did you get buy-in from line officers? Director Prosser?
When you're standing out on the street corner late at night and unable to communicate with the individuals you're talking to, it doesn't take a long time to get buy-in from having a bilingual staff. And that's what our officers were dealing with in the early 90s. First, a new population moving into the community, their inability to appropriately communicate with them, to see what their needs are, to see what types of services we can provide for them. First, again, dealing with volunteers and then paid volunteers, but then ultimately to have your own paid staff that you partner with, that you respond to calls with, that you train with, and that are a member of your own team. Buy-in came quickly and it came easily.
Officer Sonnenberg?
I would reiterate that. I think that when a program's put in place to help the officers, especially those in the field dealing with the emergency situations, it's a little easier for us to have that buy-in. I know that when I was out in patrol and I was out in the street, the struggle really was that communication aspect. And when I bring in an interpreter that's able to help that officer, assist that officer, it's hard to argue that there are some bad points there because we're getting the job done and we're doing it accurately and correctly.
Chief Baston?
Well, our situation, our community changed very rapidly. From the mid-1990s of having virtually very few contacts with Spanish-speaking individuals to the point that we started our program in 2000, which a five-year period that we're talking about. The demand for and the need for being able to communicate was just tremendous, and the officers knew very well the need that they had to be able to communicate and how important that was going to be for them to be able to carry out their responsibilities. You know, the first efforts that we had in looking for ways to train officers really indicated the willingness and you know, the desire that officers had to learn Spanish. We tried some survival Spanish and roll calls and so forth, and after the initial classes, you know, people just kept asking for more and more, and we realized that the officers were hungry for the information. When we initiated our program and started our classroom training program, we sent out a memorandum of interest, and had no idea how many people would be interested in volunteering to come in and put a lot of hard work into this class that we were doing, and it was going to take them away from families and studying and require all sorts of sacrifices for a considerable amount of time. And within a 2-week period, we had over 80 officers that had submitted memorandums of interest, even with the knowledge of how involved the class was actually going to be. So I think they knew it, and I think they knew it maybe even before we were on board with being able to provide something that met those needs.
I'd like to ask another question I'm sure that's burning out there, and that is, how do you get buy-in from the community? You've mentioned you've got buy-in from your officers, but how do you get buy-in from the community? Chief Bastion, let me go back to you.
Well, I think the slide that we showed in the presentation indicates that there's buy-in. There's definitely buy-in within the Latino community, and I think other residents of the community understand how important it is for us to be able to carry out our basic functions, to be able to communicate with everyone in the community. Obviously, we can't be effective as a police agency unless we can communicate and unless we have the trust of folks within the community.
Okay, Officer Sonnenberg?
Yeah, I also think that by providing these services, the community in our case, also has access to those same resources. That website that I talked about, the BoiseInterpreters.com, is an opportunity for them to reach out and start using interpreters and help amongst themselves. We're all in this together. I think as a community, in our case, it's very obvious that our demographics are changing, and we need to change with that. And it's not just the police departments that's changing, it's really affecting everybody. And if we can be the lead on that, then I think that's where the buy-in comes.
Can I go back to you, Officer Sonnenberg, and quickly, who verifies the credentials of your interpreter? I know you mentioned that before. Did you specify a particular agency?
The credentials, the background check is done through our backgrounders, the people who do the background checks for the police officers themselves. As you know, refugees, a lot of times when they come over, they don't have a lot of credentials per se. We do a background check saying, yes, verifying, yes, they're refugees, the status that they came over, if they had any military involvement. A lot is done, and like I said, I don't specifically do that. I leave that to the professionals, the detectives.
Okay, thank you. Director Prosser, the Hmong community in your city, where are they from?
They're coming primarily from California and coming there for employment opportunities in our community. And I want to go back to the buy-in issue, because I think we would be naive to say that buy-in is a smooth street. I think depending on which population you're talking to, buy-in comes at a different rate. Most certainly those cultures that experience a language barrier, I think, appreciate the attempts and the efforts of any organization to provide interpreters or translators in their particular language so we can reach out and provide good services. But there are certainly those in our community, and I believe them all, that might question whether or not we should be providing bilingual services and we should be expending taxpayer dollars for that. And each community has to answer that for their own, but I know in Storm Lake, as a whole, the community embraces the fact that we've changed and embraces the fact that we have to work differently than perhaps we worked 20 or 25 years ago. It doesn't come without debate, and it doesn't come without disagreement, but this is who we are today, and so that buy-in comes at a different pace.
Thank you. Officer Sonnenberg, this is from Oregon. Is there a way the Oregon courts can have access to the Boise Interpreters list?
Yes, it's actually included in the Bridging the Language Divide report that Vera has. And then if you need it, it's just BoiseInterpreters.com. Phone numbers and emails are available on there for the interpreters. And obviously in Oregon, you're a little too far away to have them probably venture over your way. But you can contact them by telephone if you need their assistance.
Well, we are getting deluged with questions here, and can I say woohoo again? Many viewers are asking the same question, and they want to know, and this is important, we in the Department of Justice have looked at this issue too, and that is, how do you assess the language proficiency of your interpreters? And I also, think translators as well. Interpreters, be dealing with oral communication, of course, and your translators dealing with written communication. How do you know? How do you assess their proficiency? How do you know they're actually doing what you're asking them to do accurately?
I'll take that.
Okay, thank you.
And it's an excellent question, and to be honest with you, sometimes it's a struggle. I look at the Burmese population that's come to Boise. That language is not only new to Boise, it's new to the United States. We don't have anything set up currently that can test that person's proficiency. Yet we still need to communicate. What we've done, luckily with some of our interpreters that have come over, they do speak both languages. We take them through, and obviously through a conversation, through the interview process with the application and background check. There's certain things that that the backgrounder does to make sure that they're understanding everything. The other issue with that as well is just because they can speak English doesn't necessarily mean that they can read and write it. So translation is a different aspect of just in our case, our program, because there's translation and there's interpretation. Most of our interpreters, though, are court-certified interpreters, and they're tested. We want to make sure that that's done, and there's several places to test. BYU has a testing site that you can get Brigham Young University has a testing opportunity for you to, with certain languages. I think New York University has one as well, and you can provide tests to the interpreters to make sure that they're at the level and that the standards that you want them to be.
Good.
I would just add, in the state of Iowa, there are organizations that are putting together both training and testing in the case of legal-related terminology in certain languages and medical-related terminology in certain languages. But the reality is, and although it's frowned upon, that many times officers and public safety individuals, when they're out there in the field, have to rely on a child or someone that is not certified, and you're not quite sure what their background is or what they're what they're exactly saying, because you're in a survival mode. And until we continue to develop these types of programs and get even perhaps national standards for certifications of interpreters and so on, we will deal with that. That is the reality, and that's probably the reality in the majority of the cases and not the minority.
Do any of you contact the State Department? Your agencies deal with the State Department in terms of looking at the certification of your interpreters as well as your translators?
I have not.
Okay.
I don't believe that our backgrounders do that either.
Okay.
No, we have.
All right. And
let's just, because if our viewers are interested in this, we should address that. There's probably a lot more resources out there, but the ability for organizations to get their staff to those and to pay for those resources and certifications is a hurdle that many of us haven't even discussed yet. I mean, using the State Department, folks like that, travel, training, certification, that's a whole new realm of budgeting and getting individuals certified that many of our communities probably have not appropriately addressed.
Thank you. This is from Maryland. Do your bilingual officers get bilingual pay?
That must be for you.
I'll answer that. Yes, they do. We actually have a testing mechanism so that if there is someone that we recruit into the agency that feels that they have the proficiency level, the equivalent level of someone who's been through our program, they're given a test and they can actually receive the compensation as well. But all those who complete the program do get paid for the services.
My department does not pay for bilingual.
Okay.
In our organization, we have no one to compare to as far as pay grades for our community service officers, and it's a struggle to make sure they are being paid at an appropriate level. In the case of office staff at city administration and those locations that have specific bilingual positions, they are paid at a higher rate.
This is from New York. Chief Bastion, the Spanish-speaking world is very diverse. How do you accommodate, or how do your officers accommodate this? You know, there are some words, Spanish words, that may mean different things in different Spanish-speaking countries.
Certainly, that's true. The majority of the Spanish-speaking individuals that we have in our community come from Mexico. So even within Mexico, there are many differences, but we try to do the best we can. Obviously, we can't have a command of all the differences in dialects, but we do feel that we have a good base and a good foundation from which to work, and we do have resources within the community from various countries and other regions that we can call upon if we find the need.
This is from Washington, D.C., and it's for Director Prosser. Can you explain why people are immigrating to Storm Lake?
Primarily for employment opportunities. We have two very large meatpacking employers there. We don't have the employment base because we are a rural community and unattached to an urban area. and they recruit and bring individuals in for employment opportunities.
Director Prosser, another question for you from Texas. How did you diversify the task force you spoke about?
Slowly. Getting individuals to step forward and to take leadership positions. And one good example is what was just talked about, that a variety of our Spanish-speaking citizens are not necessarily from one country. So to assume because someone speaks Spanish and then to groom them into a leadership position doesn't necessarily mean they're speaking for all of the Spanish-speaking people in the community. So we slowly are moving in that direction. We have, I believe, the first and one of the few Spanish-speaking females from Mexico elected to our city council. We are slowly getting folks to step forward in leadership positions. One of the other things that our city administration has chosen to do to go one step further than just diversity task forces is to form focus groups. And we now have focus groups meeting several times a year with our Sudanese population, our Lao population, or I should say representatives of these populations, and our Spanish-speaking population, specific to how we're communicating as a city organization, be it from public safety to library billing to water quality reports and the services we provide. So we are evolving also and modifying how we communicate and interact with individuals, because it's just not in many of our citizens, it's just not their way to go to committee meetings and task force meetings and council meetings. Smaller, closer groups in a more intimate setting, we believe will be more effective.
Officer Sonnenberg, this is from Ohio. Are your interpreters paid by the hour, and who handles the invoicing?
I actually handle the invoicing. Yes, they are paid by the hour. And what we did is we created a different pay scale for call-outs versus scheduled appointments. If we're calling you at 3 o'clock in the morning and asking you to get out of bed and come and help us, then we have a 2-hour minimum pay that we provide for you, even if you're only there for a half an hour. We feel like that's the least we can do for you coming out in the middle of the night and helping us. The scheduled appointments are at a flat fee, and as long as you're there, then that's what you'll be paid for.
As a follow-up question, Officer Sonnenberg, can you explain what a language line is?
The one that we use in Idaho is actually done through AT&T. What that is, it's for us, it's been a lifeline. If you call the language line, and you have to set up an account and work through them, but it provides any language that you need. You are able to access that through the language line. Some of the languages are more expensive than others. That's when I said it was expensive. It's because of that. I mean, the other issue that you sometimes have is with dialect, and another reason that we tried to create something within our own community. I had somebody from the Congo who was speaking French, and on the phone I had somebody from Canada who was speaking French. But the dialects were different enough that we felt that maybe if we could find somebody within our community that actually was from the Congo and spoke that language, that would work out better.
Thank you very much. So this language line is a resource, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and it's a pay for.
It is, and it's something that your department or your agency would have to set up ahead of time, figure out a payment process. We just call through dispatch, and we have a code that we input, and then they bill us after we use the
So it's an interpreter service.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you so much. Chief Bastion, this is a question from Maryland. What's the cost per officer for immersion training?
The cost per officer just for the immersion site, well, let me give you the overall cost. Including the classroom and the immersion experience, we're averaging a little over $5,000 per officer. That varies based on airline fare to Mexico. That's the huge, largest variable that we have. Normally, the immersion experience itself costs somewhere between $3,500 and $4,000 per officer. And if I could go back just a moment to the language line question. For viewers that are out there that may have that service available, one thing that we found very valuable to use in the community is, as you're working with groups of people, maybe new immigrants to the community, it's a very powerful expression to be able to invite someone from the group to call through your service and let the rest of the group members see, how quickly that they can have someone on the line that actually can speak their language. They can identify the language, they can speak it. And so I think that eases and makes it more comfortable for folks to be able to report or feel like they can pick up the phone, call, and get someone at the department that can speak the language and understand what their problem is.
And we'd like to encourage people to research in their own communities for these interpreter services. That we're not recommending any one particular service, for the variety of these services. And I think the key is ensuring that the whatever interpreter service you use, there is some certification behind the accuracy. Same thing with translation services. Chief Bastian, a question back to you from Nebraska. Nebraska is really helping us out with this webcast. You mentioned that after the asset forfeiture funds were used, you received federal grants, and the question is, which ones?
We sought special permission to use local law enforcement block grant funding to fund the program. It was something that hadn't been done before, and actually we had to go through a process, and we were considered as a special case to be able to utilize that funding. And once we presented the information, it was approved, and we did use that. And then that funding actually dried up for a period of time. So we've gone back to using asset forfeiture.
For those you want to know, that particular program was a program through the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance. That is a direct funding that goes to jurisdictions, the states, and sub-recipients would be the local jurisdictions within that state. Okay, thank you very much. Virginia, to all, what negative impact, if any, have your programs had? Okay, any volunteers?
Well, I'll start. The negative impact, in my opinion, is almost immeasurable, because I work with these individuals day in and day out and see the quality of work that they perform for our community. The reality is also, like in the other communities featured today, that our program has been sought after, looked at, researched, and we send information out across the Midwest on a regular basis. And I think that in itself qualifies it or quantifies it as a program of great success. But the challenges, of course, change. And when a community is changing and programs are changing and evolving, there are always individuals that struggle with that. And so I think one of the challenges early on, we don't experience it near as much today, is why are we providing bilingual services in a rural northwest Iowa community when we're all supposed to speak English. And that's the reality of it. I think we've come a long way from there, but early on those would have been the challenges and comments that we heard. I don't hear them today.
Officer Sonnenberg?
Well,
any negative impact?
Not yet, and part of that is because our program is so new. We just started this at the end of last year, and we haven't had the opportunity really to hear the feedback from people. I will say that I agree. I have heard in the past, especially with dealing with the refugee communities, that lack of understanding and not realizing that, they live in America, they should speak English, and the education process of the community, getting the community on board and understanding exactly the process that the refugees go through. They don't know English when they get here, and we try and get them into employment, into the job market as quickly as possible, and they oftentimes don't have that opportunity to learn English. So again, you go back to it may be a negative, but it's also a positive if us in the law enforcement field can take that first step and pave the way and say, here's a need, and regardless of why it's a need, let's just go ahead and deal with it.
Chief, any negative?
There are a couple of negatives. I guess the first negative, but it's not too bad, I don't think, is our program has caused more work for our officers. We really were the first agency within our government and our community to initiate a program like this, and The transition in our community happened so quickly that we found ourselves in the middle of the night. Our officers were being called to emergency shelters and all sorts of social service agencies to do translation because many of those agencies had no capability whatsoever. So we did feel an extra drain on some of our resources as a result of that. But as a community, I think it was a great opportunity for us to step up to the plate and provide a service that others needed very badly. The other thing that occasionally we run into is that some people in the community have the perception that we're paying special attention, and maybe in some cases too much special attention, to our Spanish-speaking individuals that are coming into the community. And we try at every opportunity to stress in community presentations the importance of being able to provide services to all, and how committed we are to that, and that the fact that if we can't do that and can't provide those services, then the crime situation certainly is going to increase, bleed over into other parts of the community as well.
Question: have any of you considered, and that's I guess to the two chiefs here, have you considered home growing your own bilingual officers by recruiting bilingual high school students?
We have. In Storm Lake, we've looked at a couple of different options and strategies in trying to recruit from the local community specifically for our law enforcement officers, even going as far as doing pre-civil service test seminars to give them a comfort level in the testing process. We just have not been successful in getting bilingual employees to successfully make it through the civil service testing process. We believe, or I believe, that we have great hope in future generations as they're coming up through our local school system. What we're seeing is perhaps some challenges at English comprehension on the written exams, although they come from a nationally based organization that takes that into account. The English comprehension appears to be a challenge on the written exam, but we continue to work in that direction. That is our hope.
Chief?
We've had some limited success in recruiting bilingual individuals. We certainly aggressively pursue that. But I would like to say that I think that within our community, it really has made a statement that our officers were willing to learn another language, and that we as an agency committed to providing an opportunity for officers to do that. One of the unintended consequences, if you will, resulted from our instructor, while doing the classroom training in Lexington, would use outside guest speakers to come in on a conversation class once a week. So native speakers from within the community would actually come in and in an effort that officers would be able to hear a different dialect or whatever. And I think what happened there is the people who came in and visited the classes saw how the officers were struggling, how committed they were to learning. They would laugh together sometimes and so forth. And when they left, they would go back out in the community and talk about this. And I think word spread very quickly. And so it means something to have the training and provide that for officers, and that they're willing to sacrifice their time and effort and to learn the language.
That was an excellent question, and it came from Nevada, and I thank that person for the question. From Texas, the question was, will the presentation be available for download? Yes, it will. From the Vera website, it certainly will be available. From Ohio, how has your program assisted with crime reporting and witness participation? I want to start with Director Prosser.
Most certainly our ability to communicate with our citizens has helped us bridge gaps and form relationships that may otherwise not have been formed. Our community service officers and our sworn staff have worked diligently in creating these relationships, and with those relationships comes a comfort level for individuals to come forward and report crime or witness crimes and so on, when in the past they may not have done that. As previously talked about, our citizens come from a variety of areas where not only is law enforcement corrupt, but law enforcement also translates into the judge, the jury, and the executioner. And we have to bridge those types of fears, and we've made great strides in doing that. Above and beyond just the language issue, we have also partnered with Iowa State Extension Services in our community for a program called Community Voices. It's designed basically like a citizens police academy, but it is done with interpreters and done in their native language, both in Spanish, and we've also done some for the Sudanese populations, and talk about different types of topics, be it medicine, education, rental property, rental laws, and so on, and public safety, in order to, again, create a comfort level, give more information, and let folks know that we're there to help them and to come forward. And that has translated in more individuals stepping forward and appropriately reporting when they've been victimized.
Chief Baston?
Certainly, just to follow up on what Director Prosser said, it's all about building trust. Many of the people in our community are undocumented. They have a great fear of police and government in general. We try to aggressively utilize any opportunity that we can to get in front of groups to talk about who we are and how policing works in this country. We realize that trust levels are so critical to being successful in our mission. We still solve crimes the same old way. People have to tell us that something happened, and then witnesses have to share with us what they know in order to be successful.
Officer Sonnenberg, would like to ask you a question. Did you train the interpreters on interpreting techniques?
Yes, the law enforcement training that we put on for the interpreters is a 9-hour class, and we go over the types of interpreting, what's expected of them. We go over specifically the laws, what type of calls they might be called out on. What I didn't want is for them to show up to a scene and not know what they were getting themselves into. So we spend a lot of time making sure that they understand what being an interpreter for the law enforcement agencies in the area really means. And in regard to the last question, my department I feel really lucky with is that they created this refugee liaison position. So when it comes to crime reporting, I'm kind of a personal police officer to the refugee community, and it's opened up a lot of doors for us to learn a little bit more about those communities and give them a sense of trust in reporting the crime. The other thing is reaching out to those stakeholders in the community that are working with the refugees. It allows the caseworkers now to also be an advocate for the police department and say, if this is really happening, if a domestic battery occurs in a community, it gives them an opportunity to call me up and say, hey, we do have a case here. They didn't report it last night, but is there any way you can come down and help us today?
On behalf of the U.S. Department of Justice, COPS Office, and Vera Institute, I want to thank our panelists and most importantly you, the viewers, for participating in this webcast. Again, I invite the audience to view the new report, Bridging the Language Divide, Promising Practices for Law Enforcement, as well as our previous report, Overcoming Language Barriers, Solution for Law Enforcement. Both can be obtained through the Vera Institute websites, and the first publication, Overcoming Language Barriers, Solution for Law Enforcement, is also available via the COPS website. And the second publication, Bridging the Language Divide, Promising Practices for Law Enforcement, will be available on the COPS website in the near future. Also, I'd like to share that within the next 7 days, this webcast will be transcribed and posted on the Vera website and will be later archived on the Vera website and possibly the COPS office website for future viewing. Please tell others about this webcast and invite them to view the archived version. And before you log off, please complete the exit survey. This is so important to us, for Vera and the COPS office, to know how this webcast really benefited you, and as well as to give us some indication for future activity. Thank you all so much for making this webcast a roaring success. Goodbye.